interest rates will remain high until inflation is driven down.
Interest rates are still too high for a country in recession.
Bernie Fraser became RBA governor in 1989. Back then, the cash rate was around 18%.
The bank doesn't have any intention at all of copping out on inflation.
By the time he left the RBA in 1996, it had asserted its independence from government and adopted an inflation target of 2 to 3%. G'day, Bernie.
G'day, mate. Nice to see you.
Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, pleasure.
3 decades on, I caught up with Bernie to get his assessment of how the central bank's been performing.
I think the bank has done a pretty good job, all in all. I think the Reserve Bank's steady hand on monetary policy, and remember, the average rate of inflation over the whole of the last 30 years, guess what? It's 2.5%, right in the middle of the 2 to 3% target range. It was acting independently, but pragmatically and flexibly.
So do you think the RBA built up the credibility over that time because it did deliver the employment and the rise in living standards?
It contributed very, very significantly, I think, over that 30-year period, those 3 decades, and it has to make very balanced judgments about what are the implications for keeping control of inflation and implications for employment and jobs of any interest rate change it makes. So that charter that the bank has in that legislation is as relevant today as ever, and I would hope that that's not changed. That's part of the infrastructure for monetary policy. It's been very successful. That has led to those 3 decades of pretty good growth, you know. The distribution of that growth is another question, but in terms of generating growth and generating reasonably good employment opportunities and so on, it did a pretty good job.
But he admits there's been one miscalculation, which the current RBA governor has apologised for.
So it is still plausible that the first increase in the cash rate will not be before 2024.
Monetary policy is not something that you can forecast. You can't forecast safely what interest rates are going to be 2 or 3 quarters ahead, really, let alone 2 or 3 years ahead. And that was a miscalculation and had some unfortunate consequences. But for the rest of the period, the bank, including in Phil's time, has done a pretty good job in keeping the inflation wolf at bay, and people have been pretty happy about that. And I think it'd be a great shame if that miscalculation were to lead to substantial changes in the whole framework or infrastructure of monetary policy making that we've had over the last 30 years.
The framework you think should stay in place, but you could just tinker at the edges to improve things a little bit with the RBA, perhaps the composition of the board or something, I don't know. What do you think the tinkering should be that could improve things?
The inflation targeting that we've had for 30 years, which has worked well here. An independent central bank is absolutely critical to me. The thought of going back to the days when interest rates were determined or heavily influenced by politicians is really quite scary. So it's a matter of maintaining that quality of personnel in the bank and on the board. So I think it's going to be absolutely critical that the Secretary of the Treasury, for example, remains on the board of the Reserve Bank so that there is this opportunity for fiscal and monetary policy to work in harmony. But the big gap at the present time, compared with my time, is that there's no person from the union movement. I've said in many occasions that Bill Kilty was one of the most productive members of the board during my 12 years that I was there, and his forecasts of what were going to happen to wages were always miles better than what the staff of the Reserve Bank was able, or Treasurer or anybody else was able to put together. And given that that's going to remain a pretty important focus of the Reserve Bank, I think it's essential that there be somebody from the union employment side, the workers' side on the board as well.
So you don't think the framework itself needs to change? You think it's done a pretty good job?
Yeah.
Let's go back to the distributional question though, because in 2018, You gave a speech in which you were pretty scathing of neoliberalism
Yes.
and what it had done to Australia. You said it had made Australia more unfair, less equal, and had spread division through the country. So how do you marry that up with the independent inflation targeting framework? Hasn't that framework contributed to the neoliberal project, or do you see them as quite separate?
They're totally separate in my view. Neoliberalism is about minimum tax, minimum government spending, and lots of concessions for businesses and private entrepreneurs, because they're the ones that neoliberalism see as driving the community, driving the economy. And in a way they do, they drive growth, but it's the question of the distribution of growth that neoliberalism is a complete flop. Markets don't listen to concerns that people on low incomes or facing unemployment might be suffering. But you need politicians and policymakers who have access to government spending programs and to taxation arrangements to listen and to act on those sorts of disadvantages. But that's got no connection at all with the kind of monetary policy that I've been talking about with the Reserve Bank. As I said, 30 years of relatively stable growth in Australia with relatively low inflation and relatively good employment, and that employment is important. There have been opportunities to improve living standards, but then we look at the last couple of decades in Australia, and unfortunately the neoliberal policies that have been in place over much of that couple of decades haven't been directed towards distribution in a fair way, and that's why we've got all these problems and backlogs of healthcare and aged persons care, all those kinds of things, because they've been neglected for 2 decades.
So it sounds like you're saying the RBA has held up its end of the bargain by creating the circumstances in which price stability and steady inflation were there, but governments haven't been holding up their end of the bargain. Because in this time we've seen rising underemployment, falling interest rates, but an explosion in house prices.
That's a reasonable summary of the way I think it has panned out. I've been encouraged that with the new government we've had elected recently, that there is a desire to do things differently. They've made a start, but they're not being as bold as I would have liked to see them be. They're not doing as much on climate change or in repairing all those gaps that have been created in healthcare and the medical services and so many other, in housing and so many other areas, because of the to come back to that neoliberalist flavour of much of the government that we've had in this country in the last couple of decades.
Well, Bernie Fraser, thank you very much.
Pleasure.